Welcome to the New Masculine Podcast. This is a place where masculine identifying people come together in community to disrupt outdated models of masculinity and together construct new models for our way forward as men. As a special note, while this conversation is between men, this podcast values all beings and seeks to create positive impacts for all. I'm your host, Travis Stock. I am a master life coach, an equus coach, which means I often partner with horses when supporting clients, and I'm a teacher. In my coaching work, I am passionate about the balance of masculine and feminine energies in each of us, regardless of gender. I seek to help others nurture a relationship with both types of energy, which often leads to a greater sense of wholeness. And yet what I found in my work with men is that many of us have been taught messages about what it means to be a man by first teaching us to avoid anything that is associated with the feminine. That avoidance leads to few experiences of intimacy, emotions outside of anger, vulnerability, or even a sense of belonging. Striving to comply with these models of masculinity has many of us feeling isolated, ashamed, unworthy, afraid, angry, and depressed. That's why I started this podcast, to bring men together who are ready for something new, something more whole. My next guest is doing some heavy-hitting work with men in the Seattle, Washington area. Eli Zucker is the Director of Men's Accountability at Seattle Against Slavery and leads groups that focus on ending sexual exploitation, repairing harm from gender-based violence, and empowering men to become allies in the fight against sex trafficking. I told you, some heavy-hitting work. On a personal level, Eli identifies himself as a gay man, as a social worker and community organizer, and as a friend. Eli reached out after hearing a past episode of this podcast, and my interest was immediately piqued by the intersections of who he is as a person and the work he does in the world. Coming from a community that often has wounding around masculinity, and being a change agent in the same field is something I highly respect and deeply connect with. Eli believes the mission of his work is to talk about more expansive masculinity with men who have actively avoided confronting harmful aspects of their masculinity throughout their life. Since my background is also in social work, I'm so excited to hear his insights into how we can foster change in those who are resistant to the changing landscape of masculinity. So please join me in welcoming Eli.
Thanks so much for having me.
Welcome to the New Masculine Podcast. And based on everything that I've already shared, is there anything else you think the listeners should know as a way of sort of getting to know who you are before we jump into the meat of this conversation?
You know, it's so funny. I have different versions of intros that I've given for different conferences and presentations that I give, but I'm going to have to lift that one from you. That was stellar.
Oh, I will absolutely share it with you.
Yeah, I'm so happy to be here and sharing space with other social workers to talk about gender socialization and masculinity and the responsibility that we all have to end sexual exploitation is such an important thing for me. Growing up, this was something that I didn't have to confront in the ways that I have to confront it now, working with men. And everything that I've done, whether it's as a social worker, as community organizer, has really wonderfully led me to this work that I do now and gives me so much meaning and really positive energy to keep shifting the landscape of this locally in Seattle and across the country. So I'm feeling great and so happy to be here.
I'm really curious how you got involved in this work. You are somebody that's fairly young, and yet you're doing some big work. I mean, sex trafficking and gender-based violence is huge. How did you get involved in it?
So my boyfriend actually and I, serendipitously, you can call it, but there was some planning, as there's planning in most everything in my life. We graduated our master's programs at the same time, just about 2 years ago. And we knew that his situation would be a little less flexible in terms of job prospects than mine was going to be. So when he got a job in Seattle, we moved ourselves across the country. And like I said, my background really is in grassroots community organizing and social work in that broader sense. So when I got here, it was so important to me to take a beat and show up for different initiatives and projects that were happening in Seattle, knowing that the work that I had done back home may not have been the same, may not have been led by similar folks with similar needs, with the same shared vocabulary necessarily, that it was happening and being facilitated here. So for many months, I said yes to everything and started showing up to different trainings and movements and rallies and different projects that people were facilitating locally. And so quickly, the movement to end sex trafficking, to end trafficking broadly, came on my radar. It was work that I hadn't really been settled in before coming here, but of course, its intersection with gender socialization and different identities that were really some of the most vulnerable folks in our community was just really eye-opening for me, and something that I knew immediately that I wanted to be part of. And again, serendipitously, as things tend to work out sometimes in our life, this incredible job opening to work with men to facilitate change by empowering them to support survivors and different levers of harm that men are facilitating all the time really was just an incredible opportunity that I couldn't pass up.
Well, I love that your focus within sort of the broad organization. There's like parts of the organization that I would assume are focused on victim work and working to empower victims and to give other opportunities. But you're also really focused personally, at least as the director of men's accountability, at really doing the work with other men and to really come at it from the source rather than always it can be such an interesting thing where in social work or in different areas where we're sort of really focused on the victims, and that is an important aspect of it. But if you never address the source, the problem never stops. And so then the work is just an ongoing effort to continue to support victims without actually addressing where it comes from.
Yeah, and as social workers, we talk all the time about how we can't all be doing the same kind of work. Well, I am doing work that is focused on, this really, working with men who are abusing, men who are making choices that are further harming some of the most vulnerable folks in our community. Of course, there's other people who are doing work that are directly supporting victims and survivors and dealing with policy and dealing with businesses and different institutions that have an impact when we think about sexual exploitation and what can happen or what we can do collectively to mitigate the risk and harm that exists there. So in a lot of ways, I actually have the opportunity or a real privilege by working with the men to be in this really strange sort of arena where the focus is so clear, is so concise, where we understand that so much of the harm that's happening lies with the choices that men are making. And when we organize around that to work with men to unpack what harm is showing up for men on a really base fundamental level and do work to change behavior, to offer space where in a respectful and honest way, we can hold men to do that scary, vulnerable work in their life, knowing that on the other end of it, it will impact choices and the safety of those in our community. For me, there's just such an opportunity and privilege that I have to hold that space and cultivate those relationships with those men.
Well, it's so important for me personally, and I would imagine other people in the world, but me personally to hear that there are organizations that are really doing this work that actually are teaching skills and having those conversations that actually allow a change in behavior. In my past as a social worker, I was a investigator for child protective services. So while my focus was on creating safety and well-being for children, I was really mostly working with the parents. And yet my job was sort of like the triage, the immediate safety of the child. And so I didn't actually get to provide services. And in many ways, we are a culture that doesn't do preventative work. We do a lot of sort of like punitive work. And so my job felt more like punishment than it was actually providing services that would actually shift and change the dynamics within the family that would allow for less abuse and neglect for children. And so it's really, I'm so grateful to hear that there are still social work organizations that are actually doing that work that actually provide something that helps shift the behavior rather than just punish the behavior.
And this is everything, right, Travis? We have social workers collectively are tasked with doing so much with so little and navigating such difficult
So
and
little.
challenging so little, right? And tasked with challenging these just dire moments of of humanity, and finding people sometimes in their most challenging moments of life, and trying to navigate how we can heal and grow and support the people that need it the most. I mentioned a minute ago that the work that I do in so many ways is a privilege, because I sit in this position that is somewhat, certainly prevention, but is also working with men who often have so much wealth, have so much opportunity, and for whatever reason, and there are so many, that they just haven't put the necessary energy and thought into understanding what their choice to buy sex or be have abusive tendencies look like for other people in the community. But a real privilege that I think about all the time is that I I have space, right? I have space to be able to do that prevention work where there are so many people, whether it's social workers or community members or community leaders, whose lived reality when they wake up in the morning is crisis.
Mm.
And the opportunity for me to not have to sit in a constant state of crisis, and instead do work that will hopefully benefit those folks, right? So that they too don't have to live in that crisis all the time. But I have so much love in my heart, and want to support folks that may not have that space to understand what's going to shift our culture in 1 year, in 3 years, in 10 years, in 100 years, because what they're worried about is the urgency of today, the urgency of this moment. As social workers collectively, it's such a beautiful thing when we can lean on each other and collaborate. So to the extent that I can, and the organization that I work for as well, Seattle Against Slavery, sort of the reason that we exist is to be able to take on certain projects that other folks doing direct service may not have capacity for, and do it behind their leadership and behind the asks that they feel every day. But it is a true privilege, and one that I am careful to confront more days than not.
Well, we have so much more to talk about, but I've already got chills listening to you talk, and so
Oh,
I'm really excited to continue deepening and bringing your wisdom out on this, since you're somebody that is working with men around some of the more harmful aspects of masculinity, or what we've allowed within masculinity. Really excited to get more info out of you from that. But first, I want to start by really personalizing this conversation. I want to find out a little bit more of your own journey with masculinity, and how you've gotten to the place that you're at now. So let's start by, I want to hear maybe some of the stories or some of the ideas you learned about masculinity growing up.
absolutely. Yeah, as you mentioned, Travis, in the beginning intro, there's as someone who's gay, the way that I had to find my relationship to masculinity was sort of by understanding what my relationship to my sexuality was, and what risks and harms were there for me, certainly before I was conscious of what was actually happening. But I have really distinct memories growing up of feeling that urgency, or that threat of violence, or that, even if it wasn't physical violence necessarily, but if I was my most authentic self, and if I did express, being gay, or whatever that would look like for me growing up, as there were just lingering questions, certainly, um, all of the ways that masculinity was modeled to me didn't conform to anything like that. I had wonderful men who I cared deeply, deeply about in my life, with wonderful relationships now. And there wasn't a single man that I could look to growing up that was gay. There was no one in my immediate family and my community that was a visually out man. And I think about that now as how, without that permission, right, to explore or question or invite in conversation about what I knew was happening for me, that was so many times just a roadblock in my life. And certainly my relationship to my sexuality and masculinity suffered because of that. I had to perform my masculinity, because ultimately, if there was something that I liked, or something that I wanted to do but was afraid of being outed or questioned because its relationship to my sexuality, at a certain point, those decisions change who you are. And I think about that in hindsight of who the most authentic version of me is. And I think that will be a question that continues for me throughout my life, as it exists for most all men. The way that we navigate the risks and the threats for how we become the people that we are and make choices, without necessarily always realizing that the choices that we make end up becoming us at a certain point. There's moments that I have of deep sadness around that, actually. And then there's other moments when I have epiphanies, when I do the work to realize that I have an opportunity to turn that back in moments and change aspects of my life that feel terribly empowering. I vacillate between all of those, right? It's work that I'll have to do for the rest of my life, but it's really important and something that I'm growing in my relationship to.
So you were talking about sort of that performance aspect of masculinity, performing to stay safe, to receive love, to belong, to not be rejected in some way. If you look back at your childhood or your teen years, what were those things you were performing as a way of trying to fit in?
Oh goodness, Travis. My some ones that come to mind as we think back to those lovely middle school and high school years. I was so expressive artistically when I was in elementary school. I did pottery. I did art. I played guitar for 6+ years. I did theater all throughout middle school, and at a certain point, those tasks, those things that I enjoyed waned. I think realistically out of young like attention spans, but also I remember specific moments when I stopped doing theater, for example, because of the optics of what that might mean as I was going into high school. Um, Funny enough, I switched to playing tennis, which arguably in the confines of masculinity didn't exactly put me any more squarely in the man box, if you will. But nonetheless, right, doing facilitating sort of like a sport or physical activity, which I still did love and found a lot of enjoyment out of, but intentionally leaving behind other things. I think that's sort of what the experience for me of growing up and having masculinity weigh on my own choices was, is what are the things that I'm going to divorce myself from? What are the things that I'm going to actively give up that are meaningful to me so that I can feel safe, so that I can attempt to perform, as we were both saying. Um, yeah, whether it was tennis, whether it was, certainly in ways that I'm still making sense of, but the pressure to have girlfriends, to, as all boys or most all boys do in middle school and high school, have those conversations with other boys about objectifying women, or about how we're being physical or intimate with other women, and making up lies about that. The layering that happened there for me was not only to keep myself closeted, but was also to perform this brand of masculinity that I think most teenage boys are in one way or another performing regardless, right? To get social capital, to find safety, to find community, in a deeply messy way, but nonetheless, it's community.
Hmm. Yeah. Well, it's so interesting. You're bringing up an aspect that I don't think we've had as a part of this conversation. I've talked with other men about sort of the performance aspect of adding behaviors as a way of appearing masculine or more manly in some way. But that question you posed around what am I willing to divorce myself of, or what am I willing to leave behind, or what do I leave behind to maintain masculinity or to be seen as something? That's such an important question for all of us to start exploring, because if I look back at my childhood and my experience, like there were plenty of things that I had to leave behind. My sensitivity, my emotions, my open-heartedness, my expressiveness, my just wanting to love people and to be open about that. And what a detriment that does. And when you really start to focus on how many things you've let go of or left behind, I think it does really point to, as you were saying, a lifetime of reclaiming or refinding who you actually are, not the performance version of you or the social being that you learn to be.
Absolutely. And reclaiming those aspects is such an interesting frame of it too, because particularly with the work that I do in creating spaces that hopefully give people an opportunity to reclaim those pieces they've given up. As men go about their days, most men don't have a space to pose the questions about what to reclaim, how to reclaim, right? Those things that we do, masculine community spaces where men are congregating, and our social networks for most men don't even pose those questions, let alone the opportunity to do that work. This idea of giving up things as we're becoming socialized as men is so important. I I talk about trauma sometimes in a more expansive way, where oftentimes I think we learn about trauma as having to be this grand event or this thing that happened that, has the shock factor to it. But in reality, trauma is so expansive. It's something that we all carry with us in different ways as we live our lives and go about the world. And I go out on a limb, which may not actually be a limb, but nonetheless, and say that I actually think that the process of being socialized as a boy and a man is something that is inherently traumatic for exactly this reason. The fact that as boys, sometimes in the earliest ages, right, as toddlers, we're learning about things that feel so genuinely us that are suddenly unacceptable, certain things that we can no longer feel, certain things that we can no longer like. And sometimes in our life, there's not an opportunity to loop us back, to reclaim those things that are so fundamentally us. And that idea of what that means, that for our lives, we're holding on to this tension between who we are and who we're allowed to be is so sad. I to come up with a different adjective almost does it disservice. Sometimes just sadness is okay to express that as, which it just feels to me. It just feels patently sad.
Yeah, I actually think sad is the right word for it, and it's a word that, in terms of masculinity, it's not an emotion that we're really given permission to feel. We're allowed to feel anger as men. We're allowed to feel happiness, but we're only to a certain level. Don't get too expressive with your happiness, but you can get really expressive with your anger. But then sadness or grief is not something, because it's seen as weak in some way. And so I think using that word to sort of give permission for us all to feel sad about the places where we've had to separate from ourselves. And I love that sort of framework that you created around the tension between who we show up in the world as and who we really are, that sort of constant emotional and psychic energy that's needed in order to keep those things separate
Yes.
and to keep one from showing up in the wrong place.
Hmm.
Is so powerful. And I actually really like that you brought up the conversation around trauma. And I hold it in a similar way, that there are those sort of like really big capital T traumas that are big events that happen to people, that are a moment or a series of moments. And yet there are sort of those more like lowercase t traumas, which are more insidious and more sort of just woven into the fabric of our culture, and that are, the way that I define those kinds of that trauma is any place where we have been asked to separate from ourselves, and then we believed that we needed to, and so we did. So any of those places where we had to separate ourselves to fit in, to belong, to survive, that inherently has trauma attached to it. And I think I've never heard anybody put it so bluntly, and yet I also can't say I disagree that being socialized as a boy in this culture can inherently have trauma attached to it.
Yeah, I'm right there with you. And so important too, as I have these conversations with other men, something I'm so careful about is that normative masculinity works for some people, right? Some folks' authentic self is a lot of things that we code as being more normatively masculine. And the critique isn't that those people are wrong or that they're missing something. It's that when we allow those parameters of normative masculinity to be the only thing that we can be, it's not going to work for most folks. And we have to be able, as a community, in our families, in whatever support network that we have, to be able to leave space where the parameters of that don't also invite in consequences, the threat of violence, and ostracization, right? Those things create a mechanism that requires people to make choices that aren't in their best interest, that aren't actually for them.
Yeah, thank you for differentiating that and sort of explaining that, because that is something that's so important as a value in the way that I hold this conversation, is to not villainize normative behavior, or to not make all men feel bad, or that there's no winning at if you do prescribe to certain normative type of masculine behavior. It's it is that space where it becomes the only option that leaves out the rest of us, that is the harmful aspect of some of the ways we hold normative masculine behavior. And so thank you for delineating that, because I do think I want to give space for those that do prescribe to more normative masculine behaviors to also feel safe enough to participate in this conversation and be present and to be allies and to be change makers in this, even though they may fit more of the traditional style.
Yeah. And the big, in addition to that, that's really important, is for those folks that feel more aligned with that sense of normative masculinity, where that describes more of their best, truest self, there's also a responsibility that they have, that we all have, to understand that normative masculinity, while a lot of those traits, being strong is a wonderful thing, being a leader is a wonderful thing, being a provider or a protector is a wonderful thing. And there are also some aspects of being in that box, or in that frame of masculinity, that carry not so great aspects with them, right? There's harm actually in other things. Violence is a huge proponent of normative masculinity, how it functions. And just because someone may feel connected to that, that's actually something that we're trying to tease out, right? Something that, if someone feels connected to that, I'm not going to have the same excitement and joy to co-opt that as if they feel really connected to being strong or a leader. It's important for us, as we have this conversation around what's acceptable in masculinity, and also how expansive it can be, but also have awareness that a lot of things that have been built into masculinity have been functions of the way that it's yielded power over other people. And that is foundationally unhealthy, and things that we need to have awareness around, to unlearn and take out of our being.
Yeah, I think that concept of power and how it is woven into our definitions of strength and leadership and provider and protector is such an important aspect of it that needs to be isolated out, and work needs to be done there, because so much of more traditional styles of masculinity have power involved in them, and they're usually power over. Or I was having a conversation recently with somebody where it's talking about, like, how often as men do we, when we engage with each other, even with each other, are we assessing power dynamics? Who has more power? Who has more wealth? Who has more influence? Who has more, and who has to take the alpha and who has to take the beta role? Like, there's, how rarely do we get to meet as equals in our male relationships? And that's because of the aspect of power that's woven into our what we learn about masculinity.
Absolutely. Mutuality is the word that comes to mind for
Mm,
me. And when we build relationships, when we're thinking about power, that when we take off that over, we were saying power over, when we trade over for with, those traits we were talking about, what does it look like as men when we have leadership with someone, when we provide with someone? That changes everything. When we're strong, or have a sense of being strong with someone else, in relationship to someone else. Typically in masculinity, those ventures to be strong, to be a leader, are so narrowly defined, and we see ourselves as something separate from the rest of community. It's this isolating endeavor for our own gain. But when we actually redistribute that power, and can spread that identity, or that quality, that trait, and share it mutually with other people, that's a real game changer for me, when we think about our relationship, not only with other men, but with people in our community, people that we care about in our lives.
yeah, thank you for sort of illustrating it that way. And it reminds me of the framework that I've been recently talking a lot about, which is the sort of what are the intrinsic natures of the divine masculine and the divine feminine, or sort of more of those really healthy, balanced masculine and feminine energies that's within each of us. And that is separate from gender. It's separate from the conversation of your gender expression, your gender identity. It is more from the energetic level. It's the yin, the yang, the night, the day, the light, the dark. It's the balance of the two forces of energies that play out, that we all sort of land on a spectrum within. And so the way I've been holding it is the masculine's job is to individuate. It creates goals, it creates forward movement, it creates direction, whereas the feminine's job is to connect. And so both of them in their most balanced forms are really wonderful and add a lot and are additive and generative for us as individuals, but also for the culture. As you get too out of balance, if you add too much of the masculine, it starts to isolate. You individuate too far and you're isolated out there, and you're trying to assert power or gain power, or are worried about not having enough power. And yet, if you go too far into the feminine, you get enmeshed and codependent and stuck energy. There's not enough momentum forward. And so there are challenges on either side of the spectrum. And then where do we come back into the middle? And so you're talking about, like, leadership feels like a very energetically masculine concept, but leadership with brings in the balance of the feminine as a way of supporting the masculine and actually creating more connection and power with each other.
I love this so much. And the thing that's sticking out to me among so many beautiful things that you just said is that there's not only that sense of outward relationship to other folks, but it's this piece of being grounded spiritually and energetically within ourselves, beyond what those two, or with what those two things look like. For relationships in general, there's this phrase that I never put much thought into, but when someone says that person completes me, or they complete me, what most folks are actually talking about is something that's at a deficit within them, something that may be out of balance between those two energies, the masculine and the feminine, and they lean on someone else that they're in a relationship with maybe to complete or do that work for them, not with them. But in reality, where the work starts is with us, to find that balance intrinsically, for our own selves, and then the relationships that we cultivate after, being grounded in that way, look so much more mutual, look so much more shared, and it's often, or certainly, healthier at that point as well.
Yeah, and I think that the sort of, when we talk about masculinity in men, I think that our version of that so often looks like relying on the female counterparts in our life to do our emotional labor for us.
Yes.
We can't do it for ourselves. Men are not often socialized to have emotional maturity, to be aware of, to be even able to express emotion, because there's a weakness attached to that in our culture. And so we then rely on the women in our lives, or the ones that hold the feminine energy in our lives, to really do that emotional labor for us. And what a detriment that's been, because that's such a burden to put on the women in our lives. And I don't think that's just relegated to heterosexual cisgender men. I think that happens a lot, where we lean into and become enmeshed with the partners so that they can do that work for us. And I think we're seeing that a lot. A lot of the pushback in our culture right now around that, with the Me Too movement that's gone through, and all of the different ways in which we're looking at women's issues as disenfranchised, or less than, or less valued than, and yet they've been doing so much of the emotional labor for all of us.
Oh, yes. And my heart is so heavy in that, to think about how ineffective, for lack of a better word, that is, in a really deeply soul-centered way. You know, the work that we do with other people has to start with ourselves, and focusing on what that means. Um, the the piece that I hold that I think is so important, and it's this abundant thing that keeps me up at night, is you mentioned that men aren't taught those tools to have those relationships or to feel those things. So they look to other people for them. When I think about accountability, or what work lies ahead for men, we have to have this abundance and this grace to be able to understand collectively that for so many men, this wasn't an option, right? Like we weren't taught from other men in our lives how to be emotional, how to ask for help or to find emotional support. That didn't exist. So when we fast forward at different points in our life to experiences of hardship or real tension, where not having that emotional relationship with ourselves and with others becomes apparent, there's tension there. It's a sad moment. So we have to be able to hold this simultaneous piece that says we weren't taught this thing, many of us, and it's a practice and something that we have to grow into. And the choices that we're making now, right? We can't rely on the fact that we just didn't learn it. We have to put in the energy, we have to put in the work to learn it, because our relationships now, our communities now are suffering out of a lack of our ability to do that work, of our ability to not be emotional beings.
Yeah, thank you for saying that, because it's so much of what sort of propelled me into creating these conversations on this podcast was, let's start modeling it for men. Let's start being emotionally intimate with each other. Let's model positive ways of being in conflict. Let's model the emotional work and sort of the vulnerability that's required to do that evolvement, that since we weren't taught any of those things as young boys. And I think that the wonderful piece that I love is that as gay men, in many ways we failed as real men in our culture's eyes from the moment we came into this world. And so in many ways there's a privilege to that, in the sense that we are given, once we decide to come out and become our authentic selves, we're given more permission to access the feminine energy, to do that emotional work ourselves. And so then now we actually get to be new beacons for what masculinity can expand into, that men that have access to their feminine side, that are not female, but into the sort of more connected, emotional, vulnerable, creative parts of ourselves. It doesn't have to be that other side that is isolated and way out in the um, seeking power issues. I think we're sort of noticing the limits of where that's sustainable in our world right now. It's taxing the environment, it's taxing each other, it's taxing on our economies and our governments, and it's time to evolve. And I love that, having conversations with other queer people, because we in some ways have something so valuable to add to this conversation that has not been heard so far.
Absolutely. And I love the opportunity, sincerely, I love the opportunity to model what it looks like to dream of what a new masculinity can look like, and model and fail sometimes, if there is such a thing, but model what that can look like for other men and push the boundaries of what people can feel comfortable doing. Of course, it's so unfair, for lack of a better word, I think, that for the folks who are experiencing the most difficulties, the most challenge, the most harm at different points in their life, the most visceral threat of what violence looks like, that we're the ones that are holding hands sometimes to bring other men who infringe on our sense of being safe, I think. Certainly I'll speak for me, to know that the reality in my life looks like me taking risks to expand conversations around masculinity while I sit in rooms with 100+ men a year who at different moments certainly pose a direct threat to my safety, at depending on the circumstances in the space. And to be careful, most of them are not uh, you know people who I think would do that out of viciousness or any intent. But that's how masculinity operates, is that even in the most loving spaces where I've trusted some of the men in my life the most, those are the moments where maybe I felt the most unsafe or the most unseen or the most unheard, is because it has been a thoughtless thing that's been thrown out that's further lowered the ceiling of what I thought masculinity could be, or taken me down a notch. Um, Something that I think about often, Travis, is that for any group that has to experience marginalization, or has had to have their sense of identity be formed by people who aren't themselves, we can't even dream, right, about what our fullest, most liberated self is, because we still exist in a society that has that threat of harm and violence at us. Liberation to dream of what my own version of feeling liberated and seen and valued as a gay man in this world where masculinity is posing a threat to it all the time is something that no matter how hard I dream, there's going to be a cap. There's going to be something that won't actually allow me to do it because of what I've had to experience and what we continue to experience in big and small ways every day as queer folks. Again, I know I've mentioned some things so far where my emotion on this is sad. And I don't mean sad in a way that is, you know, debilitating in most often things. It's more of this heaviness that I feel about loss and what is lost. Again, this conversation about what we give up, about what is lost. And for me throughout my life to think about when I was a kid, when I was a boy, and the things that I couldn't have, or the relationships the boys that I had crushes on, that I couldn't have access to what it meant to get my heart broken when I was vulnerable because the threat of reaching out in that way felt unsafe, right? What it means that I couldn't reach to take a risk at other moments of my life because it felt unsafe. That is a loss, and the word again that just comes to mind is the sadness of what couldn't have been or what wasn't. And hopefully by pushing now to not have other moments that are a loss, but rather things that we're slowly but surely gaining to have access to so that other folks can not experience loss in the same way that we have.
Yeah, I think that's so important to talk about those places where marginalized communities, and in this case, we're talking about sort of being gay men in this world, places where we didn't go through the sort of normative developmental stages that happen mostly around adolescence as our sexuality and our hormones are starting to kick in. And then how many ways I talk a lot about as a community, while we have more access to the feminine, and that's really a beautiful thing, there's some privilege there. There's also a delayed adolescence that exists within our community as gay men. We lost a generation of elders through the AIDS crisis, so we don't have the wisdom keepers of our community that share how to move forward and to be beacons of the new masculine. And so we've lost that piece of things, but then we've also had our own delays in development as a result of those places where we couldn't go through the normative experiences that exist in adolescence. And I think that there's some challenges there, that there are some places where we have to really look at what was lost so that we can start to look at what do we want to reclaim. And so something I'm really curious about is to hear from you as we model sort of this place of diving into our own vulnerable work, and then also what are we reclaiming, is like, what are those things that still feel to you unsafe to show up with or to bring to the table due to our current ideals around masculinity? And then what are some of the pieces that you are reclaiming for yourself that you're finding from what you left behind?
Mm, great question. There's so many things that I am still experiencing loss over. I don't know the quick version of them, but there's so many things I think that that as I walk around the world, thinking about ways that my boyfriend and I very clearly curate our relationship publicly, not out of being embarrassed or concerned about what anyone else thinks, but just out of a really base feeling of safety. That's certainly there. Ways that I've reclaimed or taken back or tried to challenge different norms. I do trainings now where I go to fraternity houses and stand in the middle of a fraternity house and do sexual violence prevention trainings and talk about this stuff, talk about masculinity to, and there are, again, wonderful people in Greek life. And there are also, as we know from different stories and experiences that I assume or know many of us have all shared, that there are also like deeply troubling experiences of masculinity that have been harmful, that show up in Greek life, maybe more so than in other spaces. It's concentrated in that way. because of so many reasons. But to be able to go into that space, into that house, and have some power and authority to open up new conversations and invite these other men into a collaborative experience together, to question what's going on and why we're making choices or showing up as the people that we are. And in the ways that we've been talking about, but in a slightly different frame now, it's no different than asking a lot of folks who've had to actively divorce pieces of themselves because of the threat of safety. Straight men also feel the threat of violence from other men. It
So
looks
true.
different and the consequences may be different as well. But all the time, one of the most fascinating questions that I get when I hold spaces with men in the Stopping Sexual Exploitation program is on week 2, which is the week before we start group sessions, almost all of them ask, when I say at the end, how do you have any other questions before we get started with group sessions? And they say, how many other men are going to be in the group? What are the other men like? Has there ever been physical violence in the group? And it's this fascinating experience to witness many of these men who the world collectively has assumptions about sex buyers and the harm and threat that they pose, to see them also be concerned with the other men that are going to show up in the group. There's a lot of posturing on these first few days. We get into group, and it takes a while for trust to develop, but it's for all the reasons that we've talked about, is that masculinity carries with it this sense of threat, this sense of being unsafe or having to prove yourself physically, emotionally stoic, all of these things. And again, sadness comes up, but it takes so long for us to realize who we are in these groups, specifically because the questions and opportunity to take risks to be the most authentic version of ourselves as men so often isn't accessible.
Thank you for keep bringing up that piece around sadness, because I think it's so important to recognize where we are and what has transpired before we can really actually create change. There's some transformational tension that's required for us to actually move the needle on this, because there's so much momentum heading in this direction and so much normalization of some of these behaviors that it's really challenging to do anything unless we actually feel the emotional tension that this has created for us. So thank you for continuing to bring that up.
And this is huge. I love the word that you just used, momentum, and to offer a feeling of hope or excitement around where we're headed with this momentum, to have conversations and movements which are explicitly drawing out men's accountability towards the patriarchy, towards sexual violence, towards gender-based violence, having these really specific moments to be able to take stock, if we haven't already been proximate to that experience or that exercise as men, around what we need to do, what responsibility we have towards repairing harm in our community. I have so much hope in my heart for what lies ahead. Men can change. Men's violence is not inevitable. The way that men can grow and learn to be the fullest version of themselves, I think, is directly correlated to the success and safety of everyone in our community. There's accountability, of course, around all of this for men to actually do the work that this requires. But there's so much hope that I have that this is an incredibly doable task, that with the work collectively, other men doing this work with men, I think that this is just an incredibly accessible and achievable thing that we can do to grow healthier as individuals and as a community.
I'd like to pull you out a little bit further on some of that, because I think there's some really important information that you have as somebody doing this work on a daily basis. And that has to do with, so some of the listeners of the podcast are going to be men that are sort of doing their own internal work and that are starting to explore a new way of holding masculinity and finding places where their own privilege or their own relationship to power is not necessarily serving them. But then there's also a lot of women that listen to this podcast, or queer people that are actually in relationship to men who are sort of maybe resistant to starting to look at this, to saying men don't have feminine energy, men are not this, just be a man, stop trying to make us beta males, stop trying to this sort of the lessening of this conversation. There's some of those. There's a lot of energy around that in U.S. culture. You see that a lot, where there's a form of masculinity and there's a lot of resistance to this conversation. So, as someone who is constantly in spaces where there is some resistance to this work, or there is some of the people you work with are court mandated to be there, or are there because their university made you come into their frat house and do the work. They're not there voluntarily necessarily all the time. And so, what are some of the things that you could sort of point to that are helpful ways to start this process, either for the men themselves that are listening, or for the people that are surrounded by men that are needing to do some of this work?
Mhm. So that's a loaded question, right? The first thing that
Totally.
comes to mind is that for so many folks in our community, um, they've experienced what harm looks like when men have some of these unhealthy behaviors. And for those folks, it's really important that I always affirm distance that they may choose to have from these conversations, right? To say, like, that's when I mentioned before about men doing this work with other men. Certainly men have also been harmed by other men, but proportionally we know, or disproportionately we know, that it's mostly women, trans folks, non-binary folks that are experiencing the most harm from sexual violence, from the choices that men are making. And I always give permission, not that I needed to, but just I always name that if those folks don't have the energy or capacity to do this work, to call in men in their life to these conversations, and that for their own safety they need that distance, like, that's a priority, and that's okay.
Absolutely.
For those folks that do have the energy, I think understanding the parameters of masculinity, which is the entire, you know, gauntlet of your podcasts, are in all these different nooks and crannies and variations and conversations to have, are so important. We've mentioned power a few times, and even though it feels maybe uncomfortable to think that we have to conform to power in these conversations, to challenge power, I think that's a real asset to changing behavior. When we can change some skills of ours to have these conversations, to, instead of saying, I love you, but this thing that you said is really not okay, using less but and more and, right? But is this thing that negates everything that we said before. That's not something that a lot of folks are going to respond to. Asking permission to share a conversation with someone can go a long way. We live often in a society with a lot of unsolicited advice. Giving someone the option to actually opt into a conversation, saying something like, hey, you said this thing that I want to talk about. Do you have energy for us to dive into it? Giving someone that option to opt in actually changes everything. And most often, because you're allowing them the choice to do the work or not, it's going to give them space to say yes. If someone's not ready to do the work, they're not going to be receptive to the conversation anyway. So when we ask for their partnership, that power with that we talked about earlier, that's so important. And then, of course, something that I always talk about that's a real skill is that conflict happens when people don't feel heard, right? Or conflicts at least can be amplified when folks don't feel heard. That's one thing that happens. So when someone says that they're feeling something, even if they're feeling it for reasons that we conjure in our mind as may not be valid or acceptable or worth our time, if someone tells me that they're feeling frustrated or that they're feeling taken advantage of, and it may even be void of all the ways that I know they hold access, power, and privilege, but if they're feeling that way, that's their truth. And for me to try to dismiss that is going to make our conversation fall flat, if nothing else. So what I do oftentimes when I give trainings or talk with these men is I say to folks, it's okay to affirm that someone is feeling a certain type of way. I never want someone to feel hopeless, right? And if someone tells me that they're feeling hopeless, even under the circumstances that feeling comes from, it's okay to say, I'm so sorry that that's where you're at. I'm right here with you. And introducing an opportunity to continue that conversation, reflect what they're saying so that they know that they're right there with you, that they feel seen. I think creating that foundational relationship with someone to sit in an emotion, to then challenge them to feel more emotive and more vulnerable can go a really long way.
Well, I'm so grateful that you sort of so articulately laid that out, because I think it's so important to the to sort of how I want to continue influencing these dialogues around masculinity is there are going to be some people that are just too far out into their own belief systems and their own stuff that there's actually no collaborative conversation that's possible, and to just sort of recognize that. And so there are some places I've received some online commentary about the podcast about me being a gay man. What does this fag have anything to do to offer us about masculinity? And that's a place of recognition for me that we're just too far apart, that I don't have influence there, that my work is not to have that dialogue and to try to make a movement there, because we're so far apart that there's really probably nothing I could say that's going to convince them of anything, just like there's nothing they can say that's going to convince me of anything.
Mm,
I'm not going to ever agree with their vantage point of things, and so if I'm not willing to move, they're probably not willing to move as well.
mhm.
But I love what you were saying around the sort of the opt-in part of the conversation, and asking to engage in that conversation, because I think it's become so easy through social media and online world to just call out and to cancel people and to really like lay in and to explode the energy. And yet there's another way to do it that invites the collaboration, power with, to transform it, to talk about it, to hear each other out. And so that's so much of what I want to keep encouraging, that yes, there are times to just call out bad behavior, or there's times to sort of disconnect and create safety for yourself when there is that, when you're too far apart. But the majority of our influence comes when we can come together and have a dialogue and be vulnerable together and share how the impacts of how we feel as we navigate a relationship together.
I'm right there with you. And I'll add that when those moments when we feel we're in conversation or in relationship with someone where that distance feels so vast, right? When we feel like there's no opportunity for a shared conversation to happen. So often in my life, I've experienced that with folks and then found at a certain point something changes. And what it means for us as folks doing this work in community, having these conversations actively, to be able to hold abundance and space for when those opportunities to have those conversations do become available, when something shifts, that we invite them in with love and abundance and space to hold that person as we're all changing and growing. To know that maybe that person wasn't able to receive that a few months back, a few years back, but maybe they're there now. And what that person needs the most is for us to invite them in and either physically or metaphorically hug them, embrace them, and show up with all the energy that we do for other folks that we love and care for.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting. It sort of brings up I was watching the ex-congressman Aaron Schock coming out into the community and saying, finally admitting that he is a gay man, even though he's been sort of either he has a history of voting against gay rights, and yet there's been rumors for a long time and things showing up in the media for a long time. And in some ways I found that really challenging to watch his sort of coming out process, which was to position himself as a victim of a lot of experiences that led to his choices, without an actual apology or an actual owning of his own behaviors. And so I think there's an interesting thing to sort of play with around, when is the space open to embrace someone and to bring them in and to allow that, and when is still a place to say, and yet you haven't come far enough, like I
Yes.
can't overextend myself just because you've taken one step. I'm going to need you to take a few more steps before I can embrace you.
Yes, accountability, that's everything, right? Accountability isn't just that we've suddenly arrived and we're aware and need support. Accountability is taking stock for each of us individually around ways that we need to repair from choices that we've made that have caused harm before. And it's a reciprocal relationship where we can't be receiving the currency, the care from everyone if we've made choices or decisions that have caused harm. We have to be doing both of them in tandem, repairing for what we've done. And for me individually, even as I'm leading a lot of this men's accountability work, finding accountability for myself for decisions that I've made that have caused harm to folks in community, and making sure that I'm doing the work necessary to repair those relationships, to repair community, to support survivors of sexual violence and other types of violence. To do that while I'm also doing this work to invite in other men and do these teachings and learnings together, both in tandem, is the constant balance that we have to strike for ourselves as we keep pushing forward.
Well, I'm so grateful that you found the sort of bravery and inner strength and inner power to start to be somebody doing this work as a member of a marginalized community, as someone who has been impacted by the challenges of masculinity, to still step forward and say, to take up space and to be a part of the change is super inspiring. It's something I feel deeply personally connected to myself. And so thank you for finding that in yourself, to have had the challenges, but also to show up in the conversation to help change it. It's really
Thank you
powerful.
so much.
So if you were going to give men one piece of advice, if you could distill our conversation down to one thing, what would that piece of advice be?
Oh, goodness. So much advice and space that this question brings up. Um, Something that stands out to me is a call to action, but also a piece of awareness. This work is hard. I think being generous with ourselves while also being deeply, deeply honest with the way that we've made choices and exist in this world, whether through choices we've made explicitly or unintentionally. There's an honesty that we should hold for ourselves, a bluntness, and also know that there are things that have existed before we've been here and things that we've had no say in, and holding the tension between those two things to move us forward is so important. And knowing that as we do that work, as men doing that work, finding new ways of being, that this work is not easy. Finding and practicing being emotional, or finding people who will support us in our social support network. It's easy to talk about changing behavior, and it's another thing entirely to actually facilitate that in our lives. So my advice for men and other folks looking to do this work is to keep moving and know that this work is not easy, but it's worth it.
That's so true. And I would even add a piece around getting curious about what drives behavior. We can be so, well, that's just the way I do it. We can get just so rigid around and uncurious about where our behaviors come from, and to start asking those questions like, why do I do things the way I do it? Why do I approach relationships this way? Why do I not feel safe asking for help? To get curious about that piece of things, because that's where real change can happen in behavior. And until you really sort of look inward and start exploring what drives behavior, you don't really have any power over it because the subconscious is driving it.
Oh, I'm right there with you. And because I can't resist, Travis, the one other thing that I have to add, which is something that I actually, one of the most beautifully healthy messages I learned growing up from my dad, was being willing to be wrong, right? And I think as men, and there are so many things that go along with that, of course, but um, as men, finding a relationship between failure and what it means to be wrong, and know that we don't have all the answers. Asking for help is okay, but more over than that, that we're going to be wrong sometimes, and that's okay. It's actually a really beautiful thing when we're wrong. Not only does it allow us the opportunity for growth and self-awareness, but it also keeps us in relationship to knowing that there are other people that we share space with, other people that can support us and do work to help push us to be the best version of ourselves.
Well, right. Why don't you just dive right to the core of the issue and just start
Hey,
noticing
oh.
how unsafe it is for most of us as men to feel wrong, to be wrong, or to fail at something.
Yeah.
And yet it is a human thing. It happens to all of us. And so the more you can develop a relationship to that and be okay with that and learn how to move through it, the better you'll be in the end of it. So thank you for offering that. If people wanted to find out more about the work you're doing or to connect with you, how might they do so?
Folks are more than happy to, or I'm more than happy to have folks look at our website, seattleagainstslavery.org, and check out the men's accountability offerings that we have. Not only do I facilitate this 10-week program, the Stopping Sexual Exploitation program that we've alluded to a few different times, but we also have this beautiful space called the Men's Accountability Community, which is where we meet monthly and do different actions that support survivors in community. We do work for ourselves that help unpack and understand ways that we exist in this world and choices that we've made in our life. But again, also sharing this communal experience with other men to grow together. On a more personal note, if folks would also want to get coffee, certainly once we are out of this moment of social distancing and isolation, I love sharing space with folks. So my email, eli@seattleagainstslavery.org, is also a fantastic way to connect.
Well, thank you for making yourself and the work that you do available to everyone. I think it's super powerful. I'm so grateful that you reached out when you heard an episode of the podcast, and that we have become friends now and share a friendship that's based in shared mission, a sense of purpose in the world, a foundational language that we speak very similarly. So I'm just super grateful that as I'm putting myself out there, it sort of drew you into my life, and that you have participated in this conversation. So thank you for showing up.
The feeling's mutual. Thanks, Travis.
You're welcome. If people want to connect with me, you can go to my website at travisstock.com. You can email me directly at travisstock03@gmail.com. Or you can find me on Instagram at travers03. It's a little bit of my personal life and as well as my work. And so that's a place where the conversation continues to be live, and we can continue outside of the actual podcast episodes, continue diving into the conversations and participating as a community around this. So I love when people are willing to participate outside of just listening to the conversation. So if you feel inspired, follow me at travers03, and we can continue the conversation there. Thanks again for joining me, Eli.